Prophecy! We're here to review the penultimate episode of the show. This episode titled In Blood Truth. Ignore the Lord of the Rings Tolkien stuff around here. I just recorded a review for War of the Rohirrim, which will be going up tomorrow morning if you're watching this the day that this goes out, which is Sunday night. So just ignore all the Lord of the Rings stuff because we're talking Dune. I have conflicted feelings about this one because I think that this is the best episode of the show so far, but for reasons that I feel are different from what I like Dune for and for what I was hoping the series would be. And that's where I ended up being conflicted, because I think that on just a pure entertainment level, I think that this one is firing on all cylinders. We have some really fun political Game of Thronesian kind of machinations. Harrow, Harkonnen, sort of making a play. Tula, Valia, everyone sort of making a play. There's some really great acting moments where characters actually get to really shine in this episode, outside of being like the broad types that they kind of fallen into the last couple of episodes. And even some of the younger characters who I have found myself not all that interested get some really great moments in this episode too. That all being said, though, I do feel like, to a degree, some of the broader political implications of the show, kind of going out into how this affects the little people, essentially, the houses, and then people who aren't part of the houses, and some of the political ideologies behind these characters, kind of fall to the wayside just for more personal motivations, which again is fine. The political stuff between individuals is all interesting, but Dune, what I kind of enjoy Dune for, these sort of larger scale sort of looks at history and politics and sort of movements of these sort of waves of politics that I don't think that this episode goes into. And so again, it kind of leaves me conflicted because we only have one more episode of the show. And so while I think previous episodes of the show were kind of sedate in terms of a more action forward, momentum stuff, it had a lot of interesting ideas that it was kind of playing with in the series, whereas this one kind of does the opposite. It has this really big forward thrust, some really interesting character moments, and yet loses a little bit, I think, of that nuance. I think this is no more shown than in the opening sequence where we get the Emperor sort of having this big speech about strength. We need to show strength. I've made Desmond Hart my sort of head of my guard, essentially, this elite team. And it sort of speaks to this sort of fascism strength ideology, but we never really get to see that play out in any other way. It's just sort of given lip service to. Whereas earlier in the series, we actually had some really interesting looks at how the Emperor was kind of a weak emperor, and how that other characters and other houses were sort of taking advantage of that, and what other people sort of saw as corruption in the Imperium, that sort of, and how that could lead into something like fascism, I think is an interesting idea. But this episode doesn't really fully delve into that aspect of it. And I think that's where I feel I've lost a little bit of the nuance. I know I'm getting into negative territory, but overall, let's focusing on some of the positives. I think overall it made for an entertaining episode. And I think there's no more is that shown than back on Wallach 9, where we get everything to do with Lila becoming Sister Raquella. This is what I really enjoyed. I said in the first two episodes of the show that I was really enjoying Desmond Hart's performance, because he was kind of given this unhinged quality that was interesting to watch, and he's kind of become static there throughout most of the show, and he hasn't really evolved that performance. Get a little bit more of it in this episode, but that same sort of fun character acting I got here with Sister Raquella in a teen's body, and it was actually really, really fun, and the actress is clearly having a ball playing that part, and it felt very intriguing. It felt like things were moving forward, but we were getting good acting during it. Some conflicted emotions about the fact that Lila was sort of not in control of her own body, and the sort of Tula and the other sister, the younger sister, whose name I keep forgetting, who has feelings for her, having conflicted feelings about that. All of this stuff was sort of bouncing off of each other in just really fun frictional ways, while also giving us exposition, having fun acting moments, and it really led to some really cool stuff. And we ultimately do learn that, and also there's some comedy in there too. It's just the show has been generally fairly humorless, which is fine. Not everything needs to have a lot of comic relief. I think generally you can have it spices up the tone a little bit, and I think that this helps. Like this whole sequence with Sister Raquella added a little bit of like, not ha-ha comedy, but just a little tonal shift in the more fun direction that I think added like really just built out the tone of this. And we ultimately learn that Desmond's abilities come from like thinking machine stuff. I know, like Omnimus, I think is the virus or whatever. I know that has to do with other Dune stuff from Brian Herbert, I believe, that I am less aware of, as I've only read a few of the Frank Herbert novels. But that certainly, I think, ties into all of that. And I think that that's a little bit to the series' detriment, where there's a lot of stuff that's tying into larger Brian Herbert Dune world building things, which, like, say what you will of whether you like or dislike Brian Herbert's stuff. I don't have a strong opinion because I haven't read them. But they do sort of like bring in extraneous elements that like fans who don't know that stuff, and I don't really know it, aren't going to be like, oh yeah, that's really cool. It just sort of feels like, oh yeah, I guess that like thinking machine stuff. Like, I don't know it as well. However, it does tie into explaining some of his origins. I just wish the series had been able to like fold that in a more organic way that felt more relevant to what's happening here. The way that does ultimately, though, fold back in, I think, is the ultimate reveal that Desmond is the child of the Atreides and from episode 3, the flashback, and Tula, which is that's an interesting development. I'm curious to see if they're going to bring that in, because again, Tula has been so separated from the Imperium, like the main going on in the Imperium storyline that we've been getting, and so it will feel very rushed to kind of bring her in and like give her an emotional impact to the Desmond character, who she hasn't even had, to my knowledge, any interaction with the entire series. Like, has been trying to prevent, but hasn't really had a strong emotional connection to, other than like what she's doing on Wallach 9 with her students and with Lila, who she cares about. And so that's sort of like, it's interesting to me, and I think it goes to the main problem that I have with the show, which is that it's too short. We have one more episode left. I don't think there's going to be a season 2. I think they intend this to be one season of this show, in which case it feels like there's a lot on the table that was rife for spicy drama, emphasizing spicy there, that we don't get to explore as much. And so I'm curious to see how they're going to try and wrap it all up next week, when I feel like these revelations are like, okay, there's nuance here that I would have really liked to see that we're not going to get to because we have to wrap this all up. And it kind of goes to my main problem with this episode of like, yeah, it's moving and grooving, but it's losing a lot of that nuance that I think makes Dune fun. And so, or not fun, like this is fun. I'm not saying it's not fun, but like what I particularly like Dune for. But again, your mileage may vary. It's one of those difficult things, I think, with adaptation. And I think I think what ultimately, for me, is it comes down to a weird identity crisis on this show, where it's like, do you want to replicate what Dune, like the Dune books are, or do you want to do something else within the Dune setting? And I think both are equally valid. I'm not one of those people that's like, you have to try and, like, as long as you're staying somewhat true to the themes of a work, I don't think you necessarily need to follow it tonally or anything like that. You're an adaptation, you're a spin-off adaptation at that too. So you can kind of do what you want, but this show has kind of been riding both. And I think that that's ultimately where it, especially in this episode, I think I wrestle with. Focusing on some other positives, though, let's talk about that. I mentioned Harrow briefly at the beginning. I love Harrow Harkonnen. I want to know more about him, and I wish we got more time with him, because I do love this sort of like conflicted, this is where I'm like, this is some interesting shit to me, where he has conflicted loyalties, where he clearly doesn't like his sister, but thinks that his sister's probably his best angle to power. But when Desmond talks to him, and he goes to Desmond and says, like, hey, can you let me off the hook for this? And he's sort of like trying to get information for his sister. You can also see that he's kind of like, maybe Desmond's the better play. And so it's this interesting sort of like loyalty that he has between like his sister and just wanting power. Like, he only wants to get whatever's going to get him the most power. But like, he also has some ties to his sister. He's not a complete shit, but he does sort of have that. And so that's intriguing. We also have a little bit of the Emperor's fail son, sort of Constantine wanting to prove to his daddy that he's cool. And, you know, that's fine. Again, there's some nuance there that I wish we got more of, like this son who wants to live up to his dad's legacy and prove himself to his dad, who's also kind of a weak guy, but now is pulling towards strength, and like this sort of, again, pull to fascism and things like that, of like toxic masculinity stuff. We don't get as much of that here. It's sort of like, like I just don't have much of a strong opinion on Constantine. However, I do really like our Atreides Swordmaster, who gets a lot more in this episode, and frankly, I've been finding him somewhat bland for most of the series. Here, though, I'm like, okay, he actually has some conflicted loyalties. He's sort of like pushing and pulling between, like, I loved his own speech when the princess goes and like truth reads him, and he sort of says like, look, I couldn't abandon you. I had feelings for you, but I would still die for my principles. I just couldn't do it then. And you could tell that he's telling the truth, and that sort of influences her, because she also feels very similarly about the Emperor at this moment. And I think that is like an interesting angle for him. We also have Michaela, I believe, the Fremen who's working for the Sisterhood, who has like conflicted feelings with our Atreides Swordmaster as well, who kind of has a little more depth to her than just being like woman who was there. So overall, coming to the end on this here, I think I kind of go where I started. I think this is the strongest episode of the show, just taken on its own merits. Like, I think it's a strong episode of the show, but I also feel like it is not measuring up necessarily in terms of what the rest of the show is trying to do. And it's better, I think. I think it's stronger than those episodes, what those are trying, but it is ultimately kind of feeling like it's a very different tone. And it's one of those things where I just wish the show had been either this tone the whole way or had stuck with its previous tone, even though I kind of enjoy this better on its own terms. But I think the other stuff better matches Dune. So again, very conflicted, but overall, I think this is a strong episode. I'm enjoying it. It leaves me very nervous, though, going into the series finale, potentially. I think it might just be straight up the series finale, because there seems like there's a lot to do and not a lot of time to do it in. And I really, my ultimate worry for the show is it's going to like resolve the Desmond stuff and then just sort of have it be like, well, everything else is going to be thousands of years in the future, and read the books and or see the other movies to really get at that. And that'll sort of leave this unresolved feeling of like, man, there's a lot more on the table you could explore here with Valia and Tula, their relationship, Desmond stuff, this era of the Imperium, like this era for the Sisterhood. It just feels like maybe they'll be able to finish it out like in a way that feels like it fully resolves everything in a good, satisfactory way. But I worry that it's just going to be like, all right, here's the stuff, and we're going to point towards future, like the books you can read or the movies that you can watch, rather than making this feel fully like it completes itself. That's my concern. We'll see, though. They have an episode to prove me wrong, but I'd love to hear all your thoughts, though, down in the comments below. What did you think about this episode? I'd like to hear all of that. Beyond all of that, my lovely, lovely friends, don't forget to check out my review of War of the Rohirrim coming out tomorrow morning, and I hope you all live long and prosper.